loss of native speaker norms? That's a question for TEFLologists. Is it better to focus on form or to focus on forms? That's a question for TEFLologists. If you use a textbook, is your classroom authentic, or should your approach be more learner-centric, from feedback to learner autonomy? We'll discuss it all on TEFLology.
I'm Matthew.
I'm Rob.
And I'm Matt.
And welcome back to the TEFLology Podcast, a podcast all about teaching English as a foreign language and related matters, presented by 3 self-certified TEFLologists.
TEFL Pioneers. Michael Lewis. He was a teacher trainer, a writer, and probably the key popularizer of the lexical approach. Mm-hmm. So have you come across his work very much as a teacher? He's been quite influential.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, mainly as through the lexical approach.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Okay. So usually we give some biographical information. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to come across much biographical information for Michael Lewis. He seems to have been a rather private man. Mm-hmm. So there's not a lot to offer in the way of his background. So this section is based on blog posts by people who knew him, such as Hugh Deller, comments on those blog posts, and his published work and discussions of his work. So I've kind of pieced together things. I found that he taught English in Sweden to all levels of students. According to Jimmy Hill, who was one of his partner in founding language teaching publications, Lewis seems to have had relatively little practical language teaching experience, but did a lot of work as a teacher trainer. So that's pretty much all the background information that I have on him.
Okay.
So in 1981, Michael Lewis and Jimmy Hill founded language teaching publications together. And the first Michael Lewis book that I read in preparation for this was actually co-authored with Jimmy Hill, and that was called Practical Techniques for Language Teaching. That was published in 1985 through Language Teaching Publications. Hill describes it as a collection of all the advice that they'd come up with in their work as teacher trainers, and it's a very practical book. So as a fairly experienced teacher, a lot of the advice, a lot of the ideas that I found in the book were actually very similar to the advice that I got on my CELTA, and also just sort of the common wisdom that I've kind of picked up from other people, over the years. It's a very kind of small, slim book, and personally reading it, I was kind of thinking, I wish I'd had this as a student teacher, because it's a lot slimmer, a lot simpler, and a lot more kind of common sense than a lot of the other training books by people like, Harmer and Scrivener and not to disparage any of them, of course, but I thought this is actually a really good introductory text. So I'd recommend people, especially any early career teachers who are listening to this, that's actually quite a good place to start. Lewis's second book was The English Verb, an exploration of structure and meaning. Have either of you read this book or come across it?
I think I have. It would have been a long time ago, but I think I have,
Yeah. So this is quite interesting. Apparently this was written in response to other grammar books which Lewis felt relied too much on French and Latin, and he thought that these propagated myths about the kind of the structure of the verb and the way that verbs are used in English. So he set out to write the English verb as a kind of pedagogical grammar. And it is, again, it's very readable, it's very straightforward, and it starts from the position that English grammar is systematic. And that a lot of the descriptions that we give as teachers to students are kind of reductive and fallacious, and they don't actually give a very good idea of how verbs operate. So, yeah, I thought that was another very interesting and useful text.
Sorry, can I just jump in? The question about the English verb. I'm trying to recall what I remember about it, but does he talk about sort of the tense system and the aspect system?
Yeah, so he talks about the future tense. So at the beginning of the book, there's like a list of questions. So there's questions answered in this book. And there's a list of questions, and then it just says yes or no next to each one. And then later in the book, it actually goes into detail. But there are kind of threads linking all the way through his work. So I noticed that in Practical Techniques for Language Teaching and the English Verb, there's a reuse of diagrams describing the difference between some and any. Like, I don't like some music, I don't like any music, I like some music, I don't like, all of that.
Yeah.
And those reappear in the English verb as well.
Okay.
And there's this focus on kind of pedagogy, and I guess there are two strands to his work. So first, his kind of debunking of common myths, which you can see in the English verb, and his focus on lexis and meaning. And these seem to build up until we get to the lexical approach, where these two threads were drawn together. Have either of you read the lexical approach?
I believe I have, yeah.
Okay.
So this was an approach that kind of prioritizes like chunking and things like that, like not differentiating between the two, but looking at kind of holistic phrases kind of thing.
You mean like grammar and phrases?
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. That's exactly right. Yeah.
Right.
So this was published in 1993. It appears on a lot of Delta and MA reading lists, and it's been an inspiration for lots of teachers, and we'll talk about some of those people later on. Many people have noted that the subtitle of the book almost seems a more appropriate title than the actual title of the book. So the subtitle is The State of ELT and a Way Forward. And this seems to have been a hangover from the genesis of the book. So Jimmy Hill, in a comment on Hugh Deller's blog, notes that Lewis originally wrote a book called Sense and Nonsense in Language Teaching, which Hill refused to publish, and told him to go away and rewrite it into something more positive. And Lewis came back with the lexical approach. But a lot of the book is focused on this kind of critique of ELT and like pretty much every aspect of ELT, and him promoting the lexical approach as an alternative. So again, you see this kind of joining of these two strands, his kind of debunking and his focus on lexis and meaning.
Right. Okay.
Yeah. So the lexical approach wasn't completely new. So Hugh Deller said in his blog that Lewis was more of a synthesizer of ideas. So the lexical approach owes a debt to Dave Willis's book, The Lexical Syllabus, as well as work on lexical phrases by Paulian Sider and Nattinger and DiCarico. I'm not sure about pronunciation there. But Lewis's contribution was kind of bringing all these ideas together into something resembling a full method, although whether it actually was a full method is a question that needs to be answered. What do you think? Do you think the lexical approach is a method, is an approach?
I would I guess classify it more as an approach than a method, perhaps. Although I think it could also be used maybe alongside other approaches.
How are you defining the difference between approach and method there?
I think approach. Yeah, I think maybe an approach would be more general than a method. Maybe a method or a methodology would be a bit more prescriptive in terms of the types of activities or like the sequence of events in a lesson, perhaps. But I don't know. I just consider approach more general.
I think it's more language based rather than activity based. That's how I differentiate between the two.
Yeah.
So yeah.
I think you're onto something there. Yeah. So Scott Thornbury, in his book 30 Language Teaching Methods, notes that whereas structuralist approaches had foregrounded grammatical patterns into which a restricted vocabulary was slotted, Lewis argued that language was primarily lexical and that grammar was there to kind of support the meaning encoded in words. So as Lewis puts it in the book, this is his famous kind of aphorism, language consists of grammaticalized lexis, not lexicalized grammar. The lexical approach focuses on students learning, as you mentioned, Matt, collocations, fixed expressions, above sentence-level grammar. So the book claims to be an approach, that's in the title, but it isn't really. So it can be thought of more as a theory of language, but not as a theory of learning. So I think generally when you have a method or an approach, it includes those two areas, a theory of language and a theory of learning. That's what characterizes something as a method, generally. And the lexical approach has one, but not the other.
Right. So you're saying it doesn't say anything about language learning?
It doesn't include that as part of like part of its theoretical framework. It's more about it kind of jumps from this is what language is to how we should teach it. And in some of Lewis's later work, he tried to tie it more into teaching. So in 1997, he wrote a book called The Lexical Approach, Putting Theory into Practice, where he tries to do this. And then finally, a book called Teaching Collocation, which he edited. Further developments in the lexical approach is the subtitle. So it's kind of a loose trilogy where he develops his thought. But again, it's all of these have been kind of criticised for not having an explicit theory of learning at the centre. Yeah.
Okay.
So one of the first critics of the lexical approach was someone who's already been mentioned, Scott Thornbury. In Modern English Teacher in 1998, he wrote an article called The Lexical Approach, A Journey Without Maps, which is again arguing that, you know, you've got a theory of language, but how do we get from there to how the students learn, essentially? Yeah. So to what extent do you include some of these ideas, you know, collocations, fixed expressions, a lexical approach in your teaching?
Yeah, I mean, again, like back when I was doing more sort of textbook teaching and when, you know, courses were organized around, okay, you know, week 3 we're doing the present perfect or whatever. I did get to a point where I maybe wanted to raise students' awareness that that's not the best way of conceptualizing language in their heads, just like as a series of grammar points that they have to acquire.
Right.
And I think, you know, no matter what sort of developments have happened in our field over the last 20, 30 years, probably the majority of language teaching still does center around those grammar points.
Yes, yeah.
And I think moving away from that, you know, is a good thing.
Yes. Well, I think what contemporary proponents of the lexical approach argue is along those lines. So basically, we need to move away. I think there are lots of people who are trying to move away from that, but they're all moving in different directions. So in terms of Michael Lewis's later life and legacy, Lewis and Hill sold language teaching publications in the early 2000s, which allowed them to both retire in their 50s, although apparently Hill carried on teaching for a while. Lewis continued to lecture and give talks at conferences right up until 2013, when a special conference was organised to mark the 30th anniversary of the lexical approach. Writers such as Hugh Deller, Andrew Walkley, and Michael Hoey all gave talks, while Lewis himself gave a Q&A at the end. There's an account and a summary of all the talks available on the blog eltlaura.wordpress.org, which we'll put in the show notes along with the rest of the references to this section. So the lexical approach has never, as I mentioned, been really fully realised as an approach, but it has resulted in an increased focus on the teaching of chunks and collocation as part of communicative language teaching. However, a number of recent publications have attempted to breathe new life into the approach. Thornbury notes that usage-based theories of second language acquisition have been adopted by some writers to add the theory of learning that Lewis's theory of language was missing. Specifically, writers like Michael Hoey, who contributed to his teaching collocation book and also spoke at the 2013 conference, published a book in 2005 called Lexical Priming, which offers a theory of learning to the theory of language.
Right.
And people who promote the lexical approach have drawn on that quite heavily. And from a more practical perspective, writers like Hugh Deller and Andrew Walkley have written a book called Teaching Lexically, which attempts to provide a more kind of practical teacher, classroom-focused approach to lexically based language teaching. And recently, Leo Sullivan's book, Lexical Grammar, addresses the question of how to get grammar out of the teaching of chunks and collocations. So, as the lexical approach increasingly relies on usage-based theories to justify it as a full approach, it's been criticised by those coming at SLA from a more cognitivist perspective. However, because it now has this more theoretical grounding, whether you agree or disagree, it appears to be gaining some influence in ELT. So, Michael Lewis sadly passed away in early March of this year, but his lexical approach, as well as his reputation for being combative, outspoken, and for constantly questioning ELT orthodoxy, lives on. And that's this episode's TEFL Pioneer. TEFL News.
We're going to talk about the IATEFL conference that took place, I think, at the beginning of last month. Now, of course, we couldn't be there. A number of reasons. We're in Japan, But also the conference is held at the beginning of April, and that's the busiest time of year for Japan-based teachers.
Yeah, well, it's the start of the academic year. So.
But I think in 2 years' time it will be held at the end of March.
Okay.
So maybe some options. But anyway, we couldn't be there. But we got some volunteers to send in some audio reflections of their experience at the conference. So we're going to listen to them now. So sit back and enjoy.
Hi, I'm Sandy Millin. I'm the Director of Studies at International House Bydgoszcz in Poland. And IATEFL Liverpool this year was my 8th IATEFL.
Greetings from sunny Egypt. This is Yasmine Abdelhamid, an EFL teacher. I delivered a workshop about the use of augmented reality in EFL classes during the conference. This was my first IATEFL conference and the first time ever in Liverpool.
Hi, my name is Neil McMillan. I'm the president of Serveis Lingüístics de Barcelona, that's SLB Cooperative. And I was at IATEFL this year, 2019, in Liverpool for the first time, in fact, having followed the conference in previous years online or with social media. I was this time attending for the first time myself.
Every year it's the best week of my year because it's a great chance to find out about lots of recent ideas from the world of teaching and catch up with a lot of my friends from all over the world, the people I see just once a year. That's one of my particular highlights, is always catching up with people every year.
The sessions that stood out for me were LABCE, where Dr. Emma of Warwick University shared the ideas about motivational perspectives when developing language learner autonomy, and the nudge theory, a concept relevant to behavioral economics. Basically, this concept means nudging students indirectly to make optimal choices while leaving them free to act with autonomy. The idea raises questions like is nudging another form of psychological manipulation? And questions about how ethical or to what extent this theory in language learning or education is ethical.
As well as representing the co-op, I was there to give a presentation about cooperatives and teacher development. Maybe the content was in fact a bit more critical. It was really about teacher conditions and the fact that IATEFL have a record of ignoring or bypassing the issue of teacher pay and conditions. So I guess I was a bit nervous about delivering that kind of critical content, but it went reasonably well. And following my talk, a discussion developed on social media, on Twitter, involving the new president of IATEFL, Harry Kucha. So we'll see where that takes us. We're due to meet Harry at some point in May, and we'll see if that bears any fruit.
IATEFL, when it's in Liverpool, is a particularly good location because the ACC, the conference centre where it's held, it's all very compact and it's right next to the River Mersey, so it's really nice. Although this year there was a lot of wind and rain, which wasn't so great. I went to quite a lot of CELTA-related sessions this year, so particular highlights were ones from some of the people who work at IH London, where they've been really rethinking the CELTA course. So, for example, Melly Lamb did a session on what happens if you get rid of input on a CELTA course. So she was talking about a kind of flipped model that they used. So they had input online, which she said did take quite a long time to create. The school gave them 40 hours to create it, but she was also doing work on it over Christmas as well. But by having the online input, it meant that they could focus the time during the course on reflection, rehearsal, and a lot more guided lesson planning. So she was talking about higher order and lower order thinking skills. So the lower order skills of remembering, which normally take place in input on this course, were at home with the trainees, and then the higher order things of analysing and evaluating that normally happen while the trainees are sitting down and lesson planning, that was happening with guidance, with the tutors and with peer support from other members of TP groups. during the day, and they also had an hour or so of rehearsal every day where they could work on areas that they particularly struggled with. Another related session was Joanna Stansfield and Marie Willoughby, again from IH London, and they were talking about managing trainee expectations and how to make the lows on a CELTA course not quite so low. There were 3 or 4 other CELTA sessions that I went to as well, one by Alistair Douglas that was about making sure that your CELTA course reflects your own teaching. And there was another one from Karen Krummenacher, which was particularly interesting because she was talking about the fact that quite often trainees feel like they're not proper teachers, in inverted commas, until quite a while after the course. And this isn't helped by academia saying that short courses aren't actually that valuable. But Karen did research with trainees and found out quite a lot about the value that they found from the CELTA courses that they participated in, and other short courses like Trinity Cert TESOL. And that's an area she would like to research further in the future.
The other session that stood out for me was the speech delivered by the plenary speaker Paula, where she talked about teacher empowerment and how it's becoming a buzzword, but no one is actually doing anything to achieve it. It was very thought-provoking. However, I expected that eventually by the end the speaker would give something like a plan for teachers, what they should do to gain this empowerment. It was like, by the end, it was just some advice towards achieving teacher empowerment, but this advice is just for decision makers. The advice for teachers was to do more research and to call it research, not just experiments.
As a first-time visitor to the conference, I have to say I found the whole experience a little bit overwhelming. It is pretty enormous, with a huge number of talks, and it's actually difficult to formulate an objective opinion of what the main takeaways might be. To give an example, in one slot at 10:20, I think it was, on the Tuesday morning, I counted 22 options, 22 different 30-minute presentations that one could go to. So I think, I could tell you what my takeaways were from the conference, but they might not reflect anyone else's. And I think, this huge variety is obviously a good thing, but it means maybe that the whole possibly lacks a coherent identity. Another criticism I would make is that talks are too short, that 30 minutes, including questions, simply isn't enough time for people to make coherent, well-developed points and have a chance to discuss them with the audience. So I would say that really less would definitely be more. That fewer talks and longer time to develop talks would benefit everyone. There were some people saying that this year was more about social justice and teacher pay and conditions. I have to say, with the latter one, it wasn't. I mean, I think maybe my talk and 1 or 2 others mentioned teacher pay and conditions. And the social justice aspect was there, although I think it has to be borne in mind that a lot of it was in a pre-conference event. But we did have Paula Rebolledo's plenary about teacher empowerment, which did finish on a very strong note, I felt, by calling on teachers to join their local union. Although Paula's the main thrust of her talk, I think, was really about the gap between so-called gurus or experts and practitioners. But she did bring in at the end another important gap, perhaps for me more fundamental, which is the gap between management or owners of schools and institutions and teachers.
Beyond CELTA, some of the other particularly good sessions that I went to were Phil Longwell continuing his work with mental health. This time he was talking about how managers can support the mental health of their trainees. I also saw Natalia Ladugna talk about how to incorporate reading into all sessions, not just through extensive reading, and it didn't have to be reading in English. She was talking about her students reading in Russian and German as well, and sharing what they'd learnt. And Steve Oak's session on working with advanced learners had some great ideas as well, and I will be blogging about all of these things in the future if people are interested. Some of the themes that I noticed from the conference were, I noticed that there's more and more about visibility, LGBTQI, IQ, and different identities. There was a plenary about that and various sessions. There was a lot of talk of empowerment, and again, Paolo Rebolledo did a session about that, did a plenary about that, and it was mentioned in Phil's talk as well with mental health, and it was brought up in various other places as well.
I think one of the main areas that were focused on was empowerment and gender and sexuality in ELT. Having this kind of focus, but I do still think that there was a kind of balance between, a certain balance around the conference this year. As talks and workshops and presentations were so diverse, every delegate, including myself, had the chance and the opportunity to choose from a wide variety of topics and themes his favorite cup of tea.
There was also stuff by John Gray, a plenary about inclusion of LGBTI plus materials in the classroom, and that created quite a lot of buzz, especially in my group, because my old colleague from Glasgow Further Education, Jennifer McDougall, had been there to give a presentation on a project developing materials for Eastern European migrants who had moved to Scotland for reasons of gender or sexual identity. And John Gray referenced that work in his talk, so there was a big buzz in our group. Jennifer was very happy that her work had some impact there. Then another thing I enjoyed was another old colleague of mine, Steve Brown, who's now at West of Scotland University, and he was giving a talk about critical pedagogy in relation to ESOL delivery in Scotland, showing how the Scottish Government's ESOL strategy is perhaps more radical on paper than it is in its delivery on the ground.
I think the final plenary was particularly interesting as well, the future directions idea. I think that was a really great way to end the conference, and I think that those discussions will continue a lot in the future about where our profession is going. And again, that included, for example, materials design and visibility for lots of different people. It was talking about the challenges for teachers and students, and again, how to make sure that everybody has a voice within ELT.
There was a lot of stuff, for example, about technology, about giving digital feedback, about artificial intelligence. There was also stuff I noticed from a teacher training perspective about how we deal with emergent language in the classroom. And more of interest to me, there were a couple of talks on course books, or criticising course books, in fact, although with quite different remedies. There was, on the one hand, Jeff Jordan, who is a colleague of mine. Jeff packed his room out and gave a very measured, I think, critique of course books. But for him, the solution is a task-based language teaching approach, which he gave a good account of as something that's actually doable given the right attitude and investment from schools and institutions. Brian Tomlinson, who gave a very similar critique to Jeff, in fact, of why course books don't work very well. His solution was to dramatise the course book, to try to bring it to life, to enhance the input, I suppose, by dramatising some of the course book dialogues with the students and getting the students involved and engaged. Not for me as convincing, but certainly a very interesting talk, and that would maybe summarise my particular takeaways from IATEFL. A bit of social justice, not enough about workers, teachers as workers and teachers' pay and conditions, and a little bit of good stuff, criticising course books, and more importantly perhaps suggesting viable alternatives to their straightforward use.
What I really like to see more of is more sessions and workshops on TEFL equity and the role of the role English as a second language has to play in social justice and self-expression.
So, again, overall, IATEFL Liverpool was another great conference, and I'm really looking forward to Manchester next year, and maybe we'll see some of you there.
So we hope you enjoyed listening to those reflections, and we'd like to say a big thank you to Sandy, Yasmine and Neil for contributing to our podcast.
TEFL Cultures. I'd like to discuss visual aids in language teaching.
Yeah.
So actually, I'd like to. We should give a special thanks to Gabriel Clark, who is one of our listeners, and he sent us an email suggesting this topic. I think it was perhaps strongly inspired by a book he's written with Lisa Miller called 102 Little Drawings That Will Help You Remember English Rules Forever, probably. This is not a paid endorsement of the book, but we did want to thank Gabriel for emailing us.
Yeah, we do accept paid endorsements. Well.
This is just not one of
them.
Yeah. Okay, so, well, first of all, so the book is basically, as it sounds, like little drawings to sort of demonstrate various grammar points or vocabulary points, both grammatical and lexical. So maybe my first question for you is, have either of you ever used drawings in your teaching? Maybe first considering just traditional little drawings on the board to demonstrate something.
The first things that come to mind is when I'm teaching things like conditionals, and you like draw a line, then I was doing this. Oh, not even conditionals,
like tenses.
I was doing this while this happened, and then you put an X on a line, and then those kind of things. But I mean, they're never considered. They're always a kind of spur of the moment, quickly draw on the board type thing. I've never actually planned to draw or planned to illustrate or planned
a lesson.
I mean, with that kind of visual I'm talking about, like drawings where the teacher actually draws something illustrates something. That's what I mean more.
I think maybe the most common is the timeline, and I guess so many of us do it that we must have picked it up from somewhere, but just like the line and pointing to the future and
I was thinking more actually about when I used to teach kids a million years ago. It's a different kind of visualization, I guess, but just like flashcards and alphabet cards and things like that. I mean, would that be included as part of visualizations?
Yeah.
It's lexical rather than grammatical. But,
Are you good at drawing, Matt?
I'm not too bad. Too bad. I consider myself to be quite a good. Actually, no, I do. I come to think of it, I do quite a lot of drawing actually in the class. But
I don't. I don't really draw on things. I gave up after I attempted to draw a bone on the board, and riotous laughter ensued.
I think for illustrating or demonstrating vocabulary, it's tricky. I'm terrible at drawing, so it never quite works.
I do. I mean, going back to what Rob said about using images, I do kind of struggle to. I wonder what the thought process is that goes into what image should I select for this particular. Because there's a lot of things probably going on with those images that maybe we're not aware of, and what are you implicitly showing? Maybe not for children perhaps, but for like older learners, I don't know. Yeah.
So Pitt Corder, former TEFL pioneer, he wrote a paper in 1963 for the ELT journal called A Theory of Visual Aids in Language Teaching. And in it he said the importance, indeed the indispensability of visual aids in the teaching process, or he talked about that. So he seemed to think that it was quite important to have those sorts of visual aids. I mean, when he was writing in the 60s, his starting point was, teachers have been, use visual aids in geography lessons or science lessons or history lessons. So why not use them in language lessons, I suppose. I don't know. I recently found myself, I recently started a new job, and I have to do academic advising where, students can come and ask questions basically. And I have one student who comes every week with a notebook full of grammar questions. And I found myself, drawing those timelines for tenses and aspects, and also those sorts of things. And I sort of did it very just automatically, because that's how I, used to do it a lot of the time. But then it made me think, I wonder how effective those things really are. And, drawing the line to represent time and, markers to represent the present and all that stuff, it suddenly made me aware of how abstract that sort of thing is, and how, I'm just wondering how useful that actually is for a student. Yeah.
Well, I mean, why do you think it wouldn't be useful?
I mean, it's describing a very particular perception of time, for example.
Okay.
If you see what I mean.
Could you give an example of that?
Of
a particular perception of time? Like, what exactly do you mean by that?
Well, I mean, for example, I always draw, like, for example, to represent time, I draw a straight line, and then on the right side, like an arrow, so the time is pointing to the right, for example.
Yeah.
And then I'll I'll put a line in the middle, right? Now this is now, and then everything that happened to the left of that line is in the past. I mean, obviously I have to choose some way of doing it.
Yeah. Well, what's the problem with that then? Are you saying? So it's not Einsteinian enough. Time should be considered a deterministic thing.
Yeah, I'm not sure. Just the only thing that made me kind of pause and think about it was that that's just the way I've always done it, and then I'm thinking, maybe that's how I visualize it. Maybe somebody else would visualize it in a different way.
I see.
Yeah.
Right.
Do you think these kind of illustrations or diagrams would help you both in language learning? Say you were learning a conditional, for example, in Japanese.
Yeah.
Would you memorize the image, or the how the language is used rather than how it looks, or
Well, that's another thing I was thinking. I mean, I think students understand the concept of time quite well. I mean, what I find I often use it as is especially to describe more aspect rather than time.
Right.
And I remember, and it may have even, like going back to Michael Lewis, it may even been connected with that, but the idea of the difference between tense and aspect. So thinking about the perfect aspect, which for a long time to me was described as a tense, but it isn't. But I remember seeing a diagram where there was an eyeball at now, and it's looking back, and so that sort of more abstract idea of
Right. Yeah, I don't know, if we go back to the time example, for me as a language learner, like one thing that I found a little bit difficult to grasp about Japanese, and a lot of people that I know who've even done like degrees in Japanese haven't picked this up, is in Japanese grammar there's a form which is teiru, teimasu. Which is kind of a continuous, right? So you'd say, tabeteimasu, I am eating. But it can also mean something is in the state of being happening.
Or it happened now and it's still...
Yeah, so like one example would be, pen ga ochiteimasu, and it means the pen is in the state of having fallen on the floor. And it's continuing to be on the floor.
Oh right, yes.
For me, I don't know if there's a timeline that would explain that.
Right. Yes.
And just giving the example and then explaining it, I can get that. And I think people can get that from my explanation just then. But there are similar points in English where a timeline just isn't going to help, and you need another approach, another tool.
Yeah. How about sort of moving on to sort of, I guess, different types of visual aids? Maybe also think about photographs or that sort of things we talked about before.
Yeah.
Any textbook you pick up nowadays is going to be full of images. Why do you think that is?
Yeah, I think it's like you're buying into a product, aren't you? I guess, and all these photos that they're using are being paid to someone. There's a market there, right? There's a market for colourful, shiny textbooks, aren't there? Really,
Do you sometimes find that the textbooks are a bit too busy? Like the pages are just very busy.
Yeah.
Too many colours and things happening. Like, I mean, the Japanese learning textbooks are kind of the opposite, where it's just like slightly off-white paper with rows and rows of tiny prints and nothing
Going
else.
close to the edge of the page.
Yeah.
I think like as adult learners, you can make the connection between the real world and the words on a black and white page, and you can connect those two. You don't need all these kind of fuzzy images around to say, that's when I'll use it, or that's how I use it.
But I mean,
don't know, maybe it's not.
I wonder if there's things from like colour psychology that go into this, like maybe just the idea of having things being bright and, you know, alarming on the page, kind of keep you alert, keep you interested.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Well, I think for younger learners, I think, you know, like, I can't imagine any language learning that doesn't use images. Like, you know, like, for younger learners, you're learning the concept, aren't you, as well? Like, you know, you're attaching a word to a sign and a signifier, is that what it's called?
But also, I mean, language learning is always, well, maybe not always, but almost always visual to an extent. Like when you greet your students, you wave at them often. Like, you know, you greet kids at the door, you say hello, and you wave as you say hello. Yeah. So they attach a visual to the sound. Mm-hmm. But that's a different kind of visual to the kind of visual that you're talking about, right?
Yes, but I think we could maybe include that, sort of the non-verbal aspect of language learning. Yeah. I mean, as I mentioned in the first section of the podcast, Michael Lewis has that diagram with the sum any. You know, and it's just an egg with, you know, half of it. You know, this is the music I like, the music I don't like. You know, and you just illustrate different amounts of the egg based on which word you're using. Yeah. And I found that to be like a really simple explanation. If I was a learner, that would work for me.
Yeah.
I think.
Yeah.
Having said that, I mean, I agree to an extent, but is there also a danger that a visual like that doesn't capture everything about that particular aspect of the language? And it may sort of narrow the sort of semantic range of what you understand.
Yeah, it leads to fossilization, maybe.
Yeah, possibly. Yeah, I'm not sure. I found a kind of interesting article by a guy called Brian Birdsell, who I think when he wrote it, or it was quite a recent article a couple of years ago.
Birdsell.
Birdsell.
Like bird and...
The word bird and the word cell put together.
Right. So now I'm thinking of
okay.
a bird cell.
All right, so you'll remember that name.
Yeah.
But he wrote about, in terms of the role of images in language teaching, using visual metaphors. So the idea of presenting students with an image, and then and often the examples he gives they're a lot from advertising, and metaphorical use of images. What do you think are the maybe advantages and or disadvantages of providing students with, as a sort of discussion starter or as a talking point or as the introduction to the topic of a lesson, an image rather than text?
What kind of image? Like anything?
I guess it could be anything. I mean, I think his sort of argument is that metaphors, I guess, are meant to sort of trigger, critical thinking or this sort of stuff. So the examples he gives are advertisements or magazine covers where they use, for example, the anti-smoking ad where the cigarettes are or bullets in a gun.
Right.
And so students discuss that metaphor.
Yeah.
That's not really. I mean, that's a good spur to conversation. Is it really language learning necessarily? I mean, it sounds like how you start a dogma lesson, as in you bring in something for the students to talk about and don't rely on them to produce the language.
But I think that image would get to new places that maybe words wouldn't in that sense. If you just said maybe cigarettes, think of cigarettes as a bullet. What do you think about that? I don't think they'd be able to. I wouldn't be able to really conceptualize what that means. I think maybe higher level, language level learners would, but I think the image would really help in that sense. Maybe.
Yeah.
But
do you remember we did that with some students years ago, and we asked them to analyse like TV advertisements, and one of them was like the candles being blown out to represent people dying of poverty, or the clicking one,
Yeah.
Thanos one.
Yeah. The Greta Thunberg one. Yeah.
So can I ask? So in the book we mentioned at the beginning Gabrielle's, but what kind of like images do they focus on? Because we talked about diagrams. We talked about what else did we talk about? Like just a picture or a drawing itself. Like what kind do they have? Yeah.
So there's a variety. So there are I think it starts with the sort of grammatical things, so timelines and that sort of thing. Actually, no, it starts with prepositions. So, helping students remember which preposition to use for which, idiom or chunk of language. And so little drawings saying, this person on the boat is on the water, this person is in the water, this person's under the water.
Right,
Different
right.
pictures and that sort of thing. But it has a few sort of, phrasal verbs, different expressions, that sort of thing. Yeah.
Yeah. Do you think that the entirety of a grammar... Well, actually, I guess you don't think this because you already said. But can it be encapsulated in that way? I know you mentioned kind of the danger of fossilizing, but as teachers, we already kind of do that, don't we? We operationalize grammar at different points in learners' development. So we give them a simplified rule, and then later on we say, well, that's not quite true. They do that when you're a trainee as well. They say teach talking time, keep it down, and then later on they say actually it's all right, but you have to be that's just part. Isn't that just part of learning? Introducing things in stages, simplified to more complex. That's what people do.
Yeah. I think maybe just the. I don't know, danger, but the risk with the visuals, that visual gets stuck in the head.
Right.
Yeah, possibly.
Have you ever taught a lesson without any written words in the whole lesson? Like, say you were going to teach some vocabulary, maybe some phrases. You could probably do that without any written words the whole time and just use images to kind of attach the words to the image, and they can...
I've done parts of lessons like that.
Yeah.
I mean, I wonder if it makes it more memorable if you kept repeating a similar image and they said, oh, that image represents this phrasal verb. I wonder, without writing it down anywhere.
Yeah. My concern for that, I like to make my materials as kind of
multimodal.
Well, no, more like the students can go away and because often students don't show up to my lessons, or they want to because I've got 60 something students, so if 10 of them don't show up, that's pretty normal. So I want them to be able to go through all the materials and get it all themselves, so I wouldn't be able to do that, but I think it's a nice idea. I'd like to try it.
Yeah, I mean, I'm thinking maybe just images or voice in the lesson, and then you provide the materials, the written afterwards, perhaps, maybe. Or
How about having students draw pictures?
I think that's shaming the students who can't draw well.
Right. I mean, I guess there are a lot of those sort of classic activities of, find the difference, or, students with, two similar but different pictures, and they have to describe them until they find the differences between the two pictures.
Yeah.
Or one student describing a picture, the other student drawing it, that sort of thing.
Yeah.
Finally, do you think you can see any place for the use of visual aids or maybe specifically images in sort of academic publications?
Well, definitely for the sciences, right? Because they include images.
So, I mean, in our field.
Oh, well, I know that...
Darren Elliott?
Yes.
Yeah.
So I know that Darren Elliott did an article for English language teacher education and development, which was... a comic strip.
Yep. Yeah, that's what I was thinking of.
Yeah.
I mean, there's a whole movement, not very recent, but called I think arts-based research or arts-based representation of research, and some of them are like Darren Elliott's comic strips, using comic strips to show a study that was done, or but I think others are using all sorts of different. I mean, painting is another method people have used, researchers using paintings to talk about their studies and stuff like that. So definitely.
Yeah.
Great. Okay, so that is this episode's TEFL Culture, the use of visual aids in language teaching.
If you'd like to get in contact with us, you can send an email to TEFLology@gmail.com. You can follow us on Twitter @TEFLology. We also have a Facebook page and a website, TEFLology-podcast.com, where you can find all of our previous episodes and interviews. We also have a book, Podcasting and Professional Development, a guide for English language teachers, which is available from Amazon and probably some other places. So, thank you very much for listening. It's goodbye from me.
Goodbye from me.
Goodbye.